Yep, it's me. I'm back. I was going to record this outside today, but if any of you are living in Binghamton, I assume many of you are, some of you are, you know that it rains every 6 minutes. And in between those 6 minute rain spells, um, it's beautiful. So, you know, the old joke, if you don't like the weather in insert city Binghamton, wait 5 minutes. Haha. I don't know what I'm doing. Since there are only 3 comments on Michael Che's special, I'm gonna take today to go back and talk about Fresh Off the Boat. So keep me on your toes. And because again, I like to incorporate your opinions with mine. That just makes it more interesting, I think, for both of us, for everybody involved. So I'll talk about Fresh Off the Boat today, and then, as the week progresses, um, continue to comment on the Michael Che and the stuff that goes up today, and just I'll play a little catch up that way. So, Fresh Off the Boat, I mean, I think it's fantastic for so many reasons. Um, First and foremost, and maybe most importantly, just the simple fact that it's about an Asian American family. Period. Um, when was the last time you saw an Asian in a lead role? I mean, on mainstream television. I know there's been somewhat of um, a resurgence, or I guess not resurgence, a surgence, right? Um, Crazy Rich Asians, and actually, that's not even a surgence. But culturally speaking, it's a huge step forward. Let's just Fresh Off the Boat is. Um, and it's interesting because there are ties to some of my other classes with Fresh Off the Boat. In 1994, 94, 91, I can't remember. Forgive me. In the 90s, there was a show. ABC had a show called All American Girl, and the lead role went to Margaret Cho, who some of you may know. She's a pretty famous comedian. She's been doing stand up since the 80s, and she has tons of great stand up specials, and she's made cameos and things, and she's had a very successful career in comedy. But they gave her a show, and it was called All American Girl, and it was about her, and she was this up and coming stand up comedian, and her family, who was Korean in this case, and it did not go well. um, and a lot of her stand up talks about how poorly it went. Here she had spent her whole life in stand up and in comedy with the goal of getting a TV show, and then she got it, and when she got there, was just mortified by how Asians were portrayed, the things that they asked her to do that completely compromised her dignity and self-respect and Asianness. Like they literally had to bring in, they didn't have to, but the network sought it appropriate to bring in an Asian consultant because she wasn't Asian enough, meaning she wasn't stereotypical, right? She wasn't the white version of what it means to be Asian. So like, she wasn't good at math. Her character, in this case, wasn't good at math and didn't play the cello, and like, all the horrible um, stereotypes of Asian. So um, she went through this. I mean, she had a nervous breakdown basically. They asked her to lose a ton of weight. They said her face was too round. I mean, brutal, brutal stuff. And she talks about it in her stand up. That show got canceled after one season. And it was sort of like, all right, Asians, we gave you a TV show. It didn't work. So sorry. And because the next show focusing on an Asian American family didn't come out until fresh off the boat. And actually, Margaret Cho was a consultant for that show, and I think she worked as maybe not a producer, but she had some input into the show. And one of her newer stand up bits is, my show was so bad it took 20 years for them um, to bring in Asians back to primetime sitcoms. But it's just, there's so much about the portrayal of not just Asian Americans, as some of you mentioned, right? Like Brandon mentioned, like this is a metaphor for any immigrant group, any marginalized group. I think can see, and a bunch of you mentioned that too, right? Who else mentioned that? Tara, I think, right? Um, just not being white and from here, I think a lot of the stuff resonates, right? It's all a metaphor for the immigrant experience, I think. And it's, and how complicated it is and how trying it can be just to be yourself in a culture that seemingly, that at many turns doesn't seem to want you here. Or if they do want you here, they want you here on their terms, right? So back to the Margaret Cho thing, like they were fine with an Asian family on TV if they fit into the white definition of Asian, right? The model minority. That's sort of something that Asians specifically are up against, I guess, right? You can be Asian all you want. Just be the kind of Asian that I'm comfortable with as a white sort of person. And then we're good to go, right? And I think that applies, especially with TV, that applies with every marginalized group, right? Like for the longest time, it was like, oh, it's fine if you're black on TV, but be a basketball player or a gangster or a thug or a rapper, and then we're fine. But if you transcend any of that, if you try to give any kind of depth to your community and representation of your community that goes outside of that, that's when we have a problem, right? And I think you can make the same case for the homosexual community, for the Asian community, for the brown community, like all the way down. And I think it's a recent development that is starting to change. It's a recent development, and it's a development that in many ways sort of validates what we're doing here in this class, which is it's showing the ways in which comedy can provoke thought and give depth and meaning and understanding to the world outside of our own little box, right? So meaning and depth and value, like those are now qualities of comedy that are as important as punchlines and jokes and you know setups and laughter. Um, and I'll talk about that kind of stuff more as I go through your comments and my. So it's interesting to note the lineage, like that it was All American Girl and then nothing for like 25 years or something, and then Fresh Off the Boat shows up. Um, and I hate the term not ready for. You've heard people say this. It's like, well, the culture just wasn't ready for an Asian family. Like that's such a fucking cop out. Not ready for like what? How can you not be ready for an idea, right? You know, like I don't understand that. But people will use that as this sort of cop out with Asian representation on television and say, "Oh, the culture wasn't ready for it." Fuck you. Um, the culture, but now the culture is ready for it, right? Because we've grown so much. Not so much as you all are probably aware. The only thing I wasn't ready for in my entire life was Beyonce's Jelly, because I don't think anybody was ready for that jelly. Just saying. Um, so it's important to understand that lineage. And for me, Fresh Off the Boat is it's about it's about representation. Like we'll talk about it more this semester, but I think you know we take for granted, white people especially take for granted that our story has been sort of reflected back at us our entire lives. You watch a movie, it's about a white guy or a white girl, right? You watch TV, it's about a white family, it's about a white person. I mean, all this whiteness, and it's it can sort of lull you to sleep and think, well, the world is white, and you know, like, and I'm part of it, and everything's great. So we as white people, and I'm glad like the makeup of this class is pretty multicultural. It's fantastic because we get some perspectives. It's not just the fat old white guy talking about how everybody, how the world is when he doesn't really even know. Um, but we underestimate the power of seeing yourself, quote unquote, um, being represented, right? Seeing yourself in a sitcom or in a movie or represented by a stand-up comedian or whatever it is. Um, that that gives voice to entire groups of people. People feel heard. People feel understood. Like, and the power of that, I think we completely either disregard or underestimate. And that's what this show does, among others. Like over time, um, I think TV specifically has gotten, and I mentioned Crazy Rich Asians, so movies, I guess, but whether you think that's a good or bad depiction of Asians is, sort of another topic. Um, but it's baby steps, right? But shows like Master of None and Rami and um, representing Indian Americans and well, Rami's Egyptian. Um, you're starting to see it more, and it's again relatability, right? A bunch of you brought up this show as being relatable, specifically those of you who are first generation immigrants or whatever. I'm like, but it's also relatable to me, even though I'm not that, right? I'm almost the opposite of that. But this is what I was talking about before with being relatable. Like, comedy is the attempt to relate, right? It's attempting to relate. It's like there's two, relating is two sides, so I have to be open to trying to relate to it. So I relate to it. All the knocks it, all the shots it takes at white America. I I relate to that, and hopefully, when I see it on the screen, I say, okay, am I guilty of any of these things? I should not be. I should try to not be, if that's the case. Um, so I think it does a really good job. And this is the pilot episode. You know my stance on pilots. And a bunch of you mentioned the Lunchables connection. Like, yeah, it's a perfect metaphor for white America. Lunchables, right? You know, everyone fit nice and neatly into their own little compartment, and you know, everything's fake and processed, but it tastes delicious, right? Actually, does it? I don't even know. I never succumbed to the Lunchable craze, and never bought them for my kids, any of that, because maybe because of this. But it's like, I always think, what good reason is there? Good reason to eat a Lunchables ever? Because it's certainly not, doesn't taste good, right? They're probably, they don't taste good, you know. They're, if not to fit in, why are you eating that, right? Like, it's almost a symbol of conformity, and the show uses it that way. This metaphor for conformity. Like, this is what you have to eat. It provides no nutritional value. It is 100%. It doesn't taste good. It's no nutritional value. The only thing it brings to you is status, or some sort of hollow recognition that you understand the rules or whatever it is, right? And you know, how much more American or white can you be? And a bunch of you mentioned the Lunchables metaphor and connection. I think they do a really good job with using that in that way, and it's pretty funny. So anyway, there's that, but something that I talk about a lot in all my classes is this idea of any marginalized group, like, the as as taxing and draining as it can be to not be represented, to not feel seen and represented in the media, entertainment media, it can also be draining and sort of frustrating, knowing that you can't be wholly WHOLLY yourself in this culture, right? The This idea of how much of myself do I have to give up today to just be seen or be accepted into, you know, a culture that is not, you know, that is someone else's, right? Into white America or American culture. How much of myself do I have to give up? Now, the answer should be none. You should be able to go out and live your truth and be yourself, and not worry about how other people are going to interpret you or perceive you or judge you. But that's not the case. And white people in general almost literally never have to say that. Like, how much of myself do I have to give up for just to survive the day? But you see it in this episode. Like, that's what a lot of this is about. Like, Randall, or not Randall, what's his name? The dad, Randall Parks, the guy who plays him. Like, he's willing to give up isn't all of his culture. right? He wants to be as American as possible. And Jessica, the mom, like, she struggles with it. You know, she doesn't want to let go, but she has to, and she does to play along, like rollerblading with the white cabal of housewives, right? And Eddie's kind of caught in the middle of it too. Like, just the thought of that is something that this show focuses on. So that I think the culture should be like, wow, those, that community has to give up so much of themselves. They didn't when they lived in DC because they lived in a Chinese community. So they didn't have these issues. But once they are displaced, how much of myself do I have to give up? It's a demoralizing thought to have every day when you get up and go to work or go to school or do whatever. And it's one that's not generally a white experience. Um, so that's something that the show really grapples with, and I think shows you different ways of dealing with it, right? Eddie kind of wants to mix it up. He wants to, as he says, get a seat at the table and just sort of, I think, work to change those things to some extent. And Jessica doesn't want to do any of it, does it begrudgingly. And the other side is um, the dad, I can't remember his name in the show, Randall Park's character. He's happy, he's fine to do it. He's completely given up all of his Asianness, right, for this American dream. So there's a lot at play. So I'll get to your comments. Will help me a little bit more. So Allison brought up the use of stereotypical jokes or that prey on stereotypes. Now I think Fresh Off the Boat, it's under a little bit more constraint because it's on a major network. So they can't quite be as progressive, or they can, but they choose not to because the audience is wider, right? They're trying to bring in all audiences, not a niche audience. So it was, yes, there were some jokes that were in there that were like played on stereotypes, but I've talked about this before. You can't eradicate stereotypes without using stereotypes, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand about what comedy does with stereotypes when it's using them, doing it properly. Like what Chappelle's Show did with stereotypes. Chappelle's Show broke down race to expose the ridiculousness of racism. So it used a lot of stereotypes to show how kind of silly they are and to sort of take some of the power away from, the weight that we give to those stereotypes. And I think that's what comedy does best, is it uses stereotypes against themselves to expose them as either arbitrary or ridiculous or limiting in all those kinds of ways. I think this show, there's some cheap ones, but for the most part, it's moving in that direction. I would argue that the only constructive use of stereotypes is to break down our understanding of stereotypes. Right? I mentioned this before in the Always Sunny video, but like, name a practical use of stereotypes. When is understanding these stereotypes helped anybody or been used constructively? I'd argue comedy is the only way that stereotypes become productive or constructive, because most of the time they're being used to break down the hatred and misunderstanding that are inherent to stereotypes. And Allison brought up the whole tiger mom, the concept of tiger mom. Well, saying that that's a negative stereotype is kind of saying that tiger moms don't exist. But I think they do exist, right? Stereotypes don't exist in a vacuum. There are tiger moms out there. So we can't portray them on television, let alone in a comedic way, right? It's like, stereotypes are messy most of the time. But, yeah, I think comedy at least uses them in the most productive way possible. If that makes any sense. And then I'll take that to the next step, which is like explore versus exploit. Now, Allison, we talked about this in TV last semester. A lot. And I think most of us are adept at understanding the difference between the two, and you can tell when it's happening. And I think it's happening in Fresh Off the Boat, right? TV especially, but comedy in general, you can either seek to explore, like in this case, Asianness or being an immigrant in this country. You can either choose to explore that or exploit that, right? And for years and years and years, it was primarily exploit, right? But now I think they're exploring these communities with humor to give depth to and help, I think, again, relate to an audience that maybe doesn't know much about the communities or what it means to be an immigrant or Asian or gay or whatever it is. So that's what you should ask yourself when you're watching all this stuff. Like, is this show or movie or whatever, is it looking to explore these identities and help us understand them more, or is it looking to exploit them? And the example where it was most glaring was in TV class in the fall, in the spring. Master of None, which is Aziz Ansari's show, basically about the Indian community, American Indian, not American Indian, Indian American community in our culture, and Aziz and primarily Asian cast that way, and his friends are, white Asian and black lesbian, so it's like super multicultural approach versus Raj from Big Bang Theory. So like Raj exists in Big Bang Theory. He's only there to be Indian, right? He's there to do the silly accent, to be a source of Indian stereotypes, right? We don't know anything about Raj or his community or his upbringing or his religion or his traditions or anything like that, right? All we know is that that's the Indian guy. That is exploiting Indian culture for, profit and laughter, and yes, it's pretty shitty. But Master of None, when you're watching Master of None, this is from a white perspective. I learned so much about Indian culture and, their relationships with their parents and their traditions and things like that. So they're exploring Indianness, not exploiting it. And the same can be said for Rami. I know I mentioned Rami before. You should watch it on Hulu. And Master of None as well. You should watch that. We just don't have enough time to get to it in a 5-week course, but Rami's about a Muslim. But it's so interesting to learn about Islam and things like that. Because it's not, yes, it realizes it pokes fun at it at times, but at times you know, it's very introspective, and it's looking at these things from, you know, it gives depth to it, to Islam and being an immigrant and all those kinds of things. And like that's the beauty of comedy. It can do both. It has chosen to exploit for most of our history, but I think now it's starting to explore, and that's what you want. I mentioned Brandon this idea that this is a show for all immigrants. This isn't just for Chinese immigrants. It's for all immigrants. Um, can I think really understand and relate to a lot of what's going on. And I talked about representation and what that means. Like, we as white people generally underestimate that because we've just had whiteness, you know, spit back at us our entire lives. Um, so we don't know what it's like to see the first white person on TV and how sort of monumental that can be and how life changing that can be, honestly. Um, Sung Yoon mentioned this idea. Maybe you didn't mention it, but this is what I thought of when I was reading your comment. It's like the idea of fitting in and selling out, right? Like, you know, everyone has a desire to fit in. I think it's human nature. Um, but it goes back to my how much of myself do I have to give up for you, for others, for the mainstream or whatever it is. And that's another thing that most um, marginalized communities have to grapple with is like, will I be seen as a sellout if I'm like um, Randall Park's character in Fresh Off the Boat, who seemingly has, abandoned all of his Asian traditions and Chinese traditions and things like that for this American dream, like completely sold himself out, right? Now, why is that bad? Right? There's definitely a stigma attached to it. Happened in the black community in the 80s with the Cosby Show. It's like, well, he's just a sellout, you know. If you're not, again, that's back to if you don't fit into my limiting definition of what you're supposed to be, then you've either sold out or yeah, you've sold out or you're somehow less than. Um, so I was thinking of that. Um, and why are Amilcar? I think if I'm pronouncing that wrong, please tell me. Because I don't want to be that asshole. It's just butchering names. Amilcar. I wrote down, why are the marginalized the only ones who have to adapt? Right? Like, I'm a firm believer that my culture, American culture, white America, why are we not trying to adapt and learn from other cultures? Right? I'm sure it has something to do with fear and insecurity and whatever, but we should want to learn about Chinese culture, you know, Indian culture, Mexican culture, whatever, as much as they want to learn about us. We should be assimilating. We just steal the stuff, right? We take tacos and churros and pizza and naan and Chinese food. Like, we just take that. I guess just foods. Um, but why aren't we trying to adapt to them and understand them better and incorporate in the same way that they are trying to fit in? Why aren't we trying to fit into their groups? I think that would be a healthy way to go about it. No, what do I know? And Sonali, again, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, please make fun of me. Um, if the show is stereotypical, I think it's to make an example of white America, right? Like to highlight again how silly the stereotypes generally are, but at the same time, not to assume that they don't exist, right? Stereotypes exist. Somewhere, like I said, somewhere there's an Asian kid who's good at math, like, duh. Um, so as it goes back to Thomas's take from Always Sunny, right? The the racists are the butt of the joke in when it's done right, and that was Chappelle's show, and that was sort of I think the gist of Fresh Off the Boat too was yeah we're going to use the stereotypes against themselves, um, and then Jonathan brought up kind of the racial hierarchy when he talked about the N word versus the C word in this case, right? And they even show that a little bit in the show, right? The black kid's like, no, you're below me on this. You know, why is there a racial hierarchy is the question. Um, and, but they all kind of understand it, right? And it makes sense that Eddie wants, performs blackness, right? With all his Biggie stuff and the way he talks and his, obsession with Shaq and the NBA. Like, he's going to gravitate towards other outsiders, other marginalized groups, right? That's who he's going to most identify with in this case, other immigrant groups or other groups like that. So when he gets sort of rebuffed and put in his place by the marginalized, that's sort of devastating for him, right? But establishing this racial hierarchy, like some races, it's okay to make fun of, right? The whole model minority thing, and I think for the longest time, it was fine to make fun of gay people and Asian people. Just you know, don't fuck with black people. Like that was it. Now, I think this show starts to give some breadth to this idea of, there shouldn't be this hierarchy of, okay, we can use these words and we can make fun of these people, but not these people. Like, let's just not do it for anybody. How about that? Yeah. And then Tara highlighted the Lunchables thing, which I talked about before, specifically, and then James brought up this idea, like this is part of what we talked about with Mac from Always Sunny. Like Eddie's almost trying too hard to, I guess, get a seat at the table, as he says, because his brother, what's his brother's name? Everett? Is that right? His brother, first day of school, has a girlfriend, like completely assimilated, and Eddie's in the just in the thick of it, and he's just fighting everything at every step, and he seems to be trying way too hard to fit in, and as a result, people are resistant to it. Where it's just like if he was just himself and just kind of went to school and did his thing and was like, I don't care what you think about me, he'd probably find his way a lot easier, right? When you're trying too hard to do anything, it's usually doesn't work out. Hence the term try hard. All right, it's 40 minutes right now. So hey, hit those comments. Remember, you need 2 per week. We're in week 3 right now, which I was surprised about. I'll be sending out paper topics probably mid to end of next week, so you'll have a week to prepare. I want to get through as much material as possible before the topics go out. So yeah, do the Che thing, and then today's stuff, like let's get a rhythm going here, and I'll see you guys soon. Peace.